Good evening, and welcome to the Poe Museum. I regret to inform you that we've encountered a bit of a predicament. It appears that our raven has gotten loose. So for your safety as well as for my own, why don't we bid a hasty retreat to the safe confines of the Curator's Crypt. This case is devoted to Poe's personal possessions. Among them, such mundane objects as a nail file, a spoon, and the boot hooks he used to pull up his boots. But there's also some great treasures in here, like the penknife he used to sharpen his quill pens as he wrote. And don't forget in the background here, this pair of early 19th century silver-plated candelabra used to sit on Edgar Allan Poe's writing desk and bore witness to some of his greatest poems. The museum acquired it in 1929 from Elva Barney, the youngest sister of Marie Louise Shue, the woman who claims that she inspired Poe to write the poem The Bells. Marie Louise Shue was born Marie Louise Barney. She was the daughter of a physician. She used to follow him on house calls and eventually trained to become a nurse. At the age of 16, she got married. And when she met Poe, she was already married to another man. She heard that Poe had moved up to what is now the Bronx, hoping that the fresh air and the countryside there would help his wife recover from tuberculosis. And Shue volunteered her services. She became very close to the Poe family, and Edgar's wife even gave her a portrait of Poe, which has since been lost. Unfortunately, there really wasn't much she could do to help Poe's wife. And Poe's wife succumbed to tuberculosis at the age of 24. In the first hours after Virginia Poe's death, an as yet unidentified artist drew this post-mortem sketch of her while she was lying on her deathbed. Some people think that artist was Marie Louise Shue, who is known to have been a painter. Shue continued to care for the Poes. She believed that Edgar himself was suffering from a brain lesion, and she thought that he really didn't have long to live. The newspapers even said that he was suffering from brain fever and would soon be dead. But she seems to have nursed him back to health, and he survived for another couple of years. In addition to trying to support his physical health, she also started bringing him to church and looking after his spiritual health. She describes him attending a Christmas Eve service with her, and said what beautiful singing voice he had when he sang the hymns. Poe is very appreciative for all that she'd done, and just a few months after Poe's wife died, he wrote the poem To MLS, dedicated to Marie Louise Shue. In this poem, he says that he feels that when he's with her, he's communing with an angel. And he followed this poem up with another one, The Beloved Physician. We really don't know what this poem says. Poe sold it to a magazine for $20, and Shue offered him $25 to buy it back so that she could destroy it. Whatever was in that poem she thought was too personal. She didn't want anybody else to ever see it. And in spite of this, Poe and Shue remained friends, and she says that one Sunday evening he stopped by her house in New York City. He was desperate. He's trying to come up with a new poem, a follow-up to a successful poem, The Raven, which you've probably heard of by now. But he was out of ideas, he was out of strength. He just needed a new idea. She gave him pen and paper, sat him down at her writing desk, supposedly under the lights of these candelabra. And then he heard some church bells ringing, and other church bells. Before you know it, they were creating such a racket that he started complaining, "Why don't you shut up these church bells? I can't get any work done." And she said, "Well, why don't you just write a poem about the bells?" And she took it a step farther, and she wrote "The Bells" by Edgar A. Poe at the top of a piece of paper, following up with a line of the poem. He finished off the stanza, so she wrote another line, and he wrote another stanza, and thus began Poe's poem "The Bells," which you definitely should read. It's the first use in the English language of the word tintinnabulation, just one of about 1,000 words that Poe just made up. When the English language didn't have enough words for him, he added to it. So you definitely have to read about the tintinnabulation that so musically wells from the bells, 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 bells. And Poe obsessively revised this poem. It started out with just 2 stanzas, worked it up to several more. He sold it to John Sartain at the Union magazine for $20, which was more than he made for The Raven. Then he made some improvements and got more money for it. Then he made more improvements, and Sartain paid even more. So he made about $45 off this poem compared with the $15 he made off of The Raven. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the poem's success. It was published just after his death, and now it's one of his best-known poems, one of his most beloved poems. And as for Poe's relationship with Marie Louise Shue, he wrote her another poem, To Marie Louise. Not one of his best poems, but at least she didn't destroy this one. But by this time, their relationship was coming to an end. Her spiritual advisor and friend read one of Poe's books, Eureka, Poe's Theory of Everything book, and thought that Poe was a hopeless pantheist, atheist, deist. He said, "I'm not sure what he is, but you have to get rid of this guy. He's bad for your soul." And the pastor apparently even went to Poe's house and argued with him about this book, and Poe told him that it was impossible for him to believe there's any being in the universe superior to himself. So he must be God. Blasphemy. And maybe that's what Poe meant. Maybe he was just saying that we're all God. That seems to be the general flow of the book, is that everything is all connected. Everything is one. But whatever it was, it didn't jive with Shue's pastor, so she dumped him with a letter. She wrote him and said, "I can never see you again, you're bad for my soul." He wrote her back, just devastated, saying, "How can you do this to me in my time of need? My friend, my physician, I had so much faith in you." But it was over. She never saw him again. And as we all know, he died about a year later. But after it didn't work out with Marie Louise Shue, up in Lowell, Massachusetts, he fell in love with Annie Richmond. Unfortunately, she was also married, and that wouldn't have worked out. So then, in Providence, Rhode Island, he fell in love with Sarah Helen Whitman, and that didn't work out. They're engaged for about a month, and then he returned to Richmond, where he renewed his very first engagement with Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, and was engaged to her at the time of his death. And after Poe's death, Marie Louise Shue assisted Poe's mother-in-law financially. She bought up some of her things to help her afford to move out of the cottage in the Bronx where they were living and move in with some friends elsewhere. And that's a way that Shue had financially assisted the Poes. Edgar would have been too proud to just take charity, but he very often accepted money as loans, even though he knew he couldn't afford to pay them back. I guess he was optimistic that eventually he'd be able to pay them back. And this is how she got those candelabras. She bought them during Virginia Poe's illness to help the Poe family. So apparently they were on Poe's writing desk, and then they moved to Marie Louise Schu's house, and they were probably sitting there right on the desk as he wrote the poem The Bells, along with some of his other late and great works. Who knows, maybe Annabel Lee was written partially under the lights of these candelabra. Well, thanks for joining us this week. And just remember, if you'd like to see any of these priceless Edgar Allan Poe artifacts in person, you can. Because I'm proud to announce the Poe Museum has just reopened to the public. So for more information and to buy your tickets, just visit poemuseum.org. Well, thanks for joining us this week. And if you'd like to learn more about how to avoid raven attacks, why not check out one of these informative books from the Poe Museum's online store at poemuseum.org/museum-store.